There is a specific kind of tiredness that does not show up on any medical chart. It is the tiredness of someone who has been trying to be good enough, who has read the verses, done the practices, shown up when they did not want to show up, served when the serving felt hollow, prayed when nothing returned. You know the moment. That Sunday morning when you are getting ready for church and somewhere between the bathroom mirror and the car door, something in you deflates, not with anger, not with doubt exactly, just with a gray heaviness that has no name and no particular reason for arriving when it does. The moment in a worship service when everyone around you seems to be experiencing something and you are standing there going through the motions, wondering what is wrong. Wondering what is wrong with you, that you cannot feel it anymore. That absence where something used to be, that hollow where the warmth once lived. The tightness in your chest when another sermon starts with what you need to do more of. Pray more, trust more, give more, surrender more. Again, the quiet shame of sitting with a passage you have read 100 times and feeling nothing. Not even doubt, just absence. Just an empty space where meaning was. The way you have started underlining things in Christian books that used to light something up in you, and now you are just underlining because you are supposed to. If you have felt this, you are not broken. You are not losing your faith. You are paying attention to something real that deserves a real answer. There's a verse that has probably been quoted at you many times in this condition. Jesus saying, "Come to me all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." And if you are honest, every time you hear it, some part of you thinks a yoke is a harness, another thing to carry. He's asking me to carry something else. I'm already so tired. The invitation to rest comes with a piece of equipment attached, and that feels wrong. What if the problem is not your faith? What if the problem is that no one ever told you what a yoke actually meant to the people who first heard this? Because when I understood it, really understood it, something I had been carrying for years finally came off. The weight was real, but it was never mine to carry. Marcus spent 22 years in pastoral ministry, not as a volunteer, as the person people called when their marriages were ending. Their children were leaving the faith. He was the one who showed up when the diagnosis came back wrong. He was also the one who around year 15 stopped being able to pray without a script, not because he stopped believing. Because somewhere along the way, prayer had become a performance he gave before an audience he could not disappoint or fail or leave. When he told me this, he said something I have not stopped thinking about. He said, "I think I have been carrying a yoke that Jesus never put on me. I just do not know how to put it down." He was more theologically precise than he knew. He had named the exact problem without fully realizing it. In first-century Judaism, a rabbi's yoke was not a metaphor for difficulty. It was a technical term that every student in that culture understood immediately and completely. Every rabbi had a yoke, his particular interpretation of the Torah, his rulings on what God required, how to read each passage, what each commandment meant in daily life, what was permitted, what was forbidden, what made you clean, what made you unclean. When you became a student of a rabbi, you took his yoke upon yourself. You accepted his interpretive framework. You lived inside his reading of what God was asking. And different rabbis had very different yokes with very different weights attached. The Pharisees' yoke was famously heavy, not because they were villains. They were trying to protect the law through elaborate fences built carefully around the original commands. The accumulation of 613 commandments, plus oral tradition, plus interpretive rulings, created something almost impossible to carry without stumbling under the weight. And if you could not carry it perfectly, you were out. Unclean, not enough. Most of the people listening to Jesus that day knew this weight intimately and personally. They had been measured against a yoke and found wanting. Not because God had measured them, because the system had, because human hands had built the scale entirely. And into that exhaustion, Jesus said, "Come to me." Not try harder under a better system. Not, here are corrected rules. Just come. Just come to me directly. And what I offer you, my yoke, my reading of what God actually requires, is different in its fundamental nature from everything you have been carrying until now. For my yoke is easy. The Greek word is fitted to the one bearing it, suited to your actual size, not the ideal size. The actual one. A well-made yoke in the ancient world was cut for the specific animal. If it chafed, the carpenter had not done the work properly. Fit was entirely the craftsman's responsibility. The yoke that fit felt paradoxically lighter than carrying the weight on an uneven shoulder. Jesus is not offering you less to carry. He is offering a yoke cut for you. Before his ministry, Jesus was a craftsman, someone who worked with wood, who made things for people to use with their hands and their bodies in daily labor. He had in all likelihood made yokes, had measured animals, had stood in the workshop and understood what fit meant, what designed for you meant at a physical level. He had seen what a poorly fitted yoke did. How it redistributed weight wrong, how it exhausted the animal faster than the load itself ever would. When he says, "My yoke is easy," he is not speaking in abstraction. He is speaking with the precision of a craftsman who has stood in the sawdust and understood the difference between carrying something designed for you and carrying something cut for someone else's shoulders. One wears you in. The other just wears you out entirely. The invitation is not to stop carrying. It is to stop carrying something that was never cut for you. That distinction changes everything about how you read the verse. If it has been chafing for years, if the spiritual life you have been trying to maintain has left marks that look less like growth and more like damage, the chafing is not evidence that you're too weak. It is evidence that the yoke was never fitted. The problem was never your strength. It was always the fit. Marcus sat with us for 3 days before he said anything. Then he called and said, "I have been carrying the Pharisees' yoke my entire ministry. I thought it was God's." The pattern runs deeper than one passage. 2 chapters later in Matthew 23, Jesus watches the Pharisees and says something stunning that most people read past without pausing. He says, "They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger." He is describing the mechanics of a particular kind of spiritual authority, the kind that defines what God requires without inhabiting the requirement itself at all, that loads you with the standard and then watches to see if you can maintain it. You have likely experienced this, not necessarily from a Pharisee in ancient robes, maybe from a pastor whose theology was technically correct, but whose care for you was entirely conditional on your performance, your visible faithfulness, your public sanctity. Maybe from a church culture where your worth was measured by your attendance and your giving. Maybe from your own internal voice that never stops auditing you. A voice which absorbed the standard so completely that it became indistinguishable from God's voice. This is what makes this kind of exhaustion so deeply disorienting to carry. The yoke was not put on you by God, but it has been speaking in God's register for so long that you cannot find the seam between the two anymore. I want to stay with that for a moment because I think it is the most important thing in this entire conversation, and it almost never gets said out loud. The voice that has been evaluating you, the one that runs the daily audit, that tallies the shortfalls and holds your spiritual life to a standard that keeps moving further away. That voice learned to sound like God's voice. It quotes Scripture. It uses the language of holiness and calling and faithfulness. It sounds right. It sounds exactly like truth. It frames its demands as heaven's expectations. But there is one way to tell the difference between a voice that is mine and one wearing my register without my authority. Mine produces peace. Even when it convicts with a lightness. The lightness of something being named so it can be released. Not named so it can be wielded. Even when it calls you higher, there is a steadiness underneath it, a sense that the one calling you upward is also the one holding you while you climb. The voice of the wrong yoke produces something else. Tightness, dread, the gray heaviness of the Sunday morning mirror. The arithmetic of never quite enough. If the voice in your head produces dread, it is not mine. That is the yoke speaking. That is the standard talking. That voice is not God. That is the system built by human anxiety around divine truth that has been placed on your shoulders and told you with complete confidence it was God's own design. When Jesus says in Matthew 11, "Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart," he is not offering a different personality. He is revealing a completely different posture. The word translated lowly is not self-deprecating, not weak. It means not elevated above the people you are serving, not requiring performance to approach. Jesus is describing a rabbi whose authority is exercised from beside people, not above them, whose yoke is cut from knowledge of your actual weight-bearing capacity right now. The Pharisees measured from the standard down to the person. Jesus measures from the person up toward the possible. That is not a small difference. It changes everything. When Jesus is pressed on the greatest commandment, love God, love your neighbor, he says on these two hang all the law and all the prophets. He is not reducing the law. He is revealing what it was always organized around. The law was never a performance metric. It was a description of what love looks like. And if your reading of the law leaves love looking exhausted and empty and unable to feel anything in a worship service, you are carrying the wrong yoke entirely. Acts 15. The early church is in crisis. Certain teachers have gone to the Gentile communities and said, unless you carry the full weight of the law, you cannot be saved. Peter stands up and asks, why are you putting God to the test by placing on the neck of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers could bear? Peter, who was Jewish from birth, who had lived inside this tradition his entire life, standing before a council and saying, we ourselves have been failing to carry it all along. The council agreed. They sent a letter saying it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these necessary things. No greater burden than necessary. The early church at its first theological crisis did not ask how to get more people carrying more. They asked what is actually necessary. They asked what can we take off. They were asking about fit. They were asking the craftsman's question rather than the accountant's question, and the difference mattered eternally. Paul confirms the same pattern in Galatians. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. That word is slavery, not a yoke of challenge, not necessary discipline. Slavery. Because what the heavy yoke produces when carried across enough years is not spiritual strength, but something else entirely. It produces the psychology of someone who cannot stop, who cannot rest without guilt accumulating, who cannot receive grace without immediately translating it into a new obligation, who has been under the yoke so long that freedom feels less like relief and more like danger. That is not faithfulness. That is captivity mistaken for devotion over years. If stopping the performance feels more threatening than continuing it, if rest produces anxiety rather than peace, that is not deep faith. That is what slavery does to a person. The freedom is not something you work toward. It is already the ground you are standing on. The question is only whether you will stop pretending you are still captive. We have built enormous institutional Christianity on the Pharisaic model. Not because we are malicious, but because metrics are comforting and countable. Things feel like measurable progress. Attendance can be counted, giving can be measured, volunteering can be tracked. And somewhere in the institutionalization of faith, the fitted yoke got replaced with the measurable one quietly. Your worth is legible if it is countable. And if it is not countable, you spend Sunday mornings in the mirror wondering whether you are doing enough to qualify today. The wrong yoke gets heavier with time, not lighter. The more years you have been following, the higher the standard climbs. You know better now. You have been through more. You have no excuse for the doubt, for the emptiness, for the gaps. Maturity in the wrong yoke framework does not produce more grace for yourself. It produces less. The longer you have been a Christian, the smaller your margin for struggle. My beloved, that is not how I work. The Christos yoke does not tighten with experience. The fit that is right for you does not become more demanding simply because you have been wearing it longer. Experience in my yoke produces rest, not increasing weight. What you have been experiencing, the increasing heaviness, the shrinking margin, the standard that recedes as you approach it. That is the signature of the wrong yoke, not mature faith. Marcus eventually left pastoral ministry for 2 years. Not increases, in deliberate rest. He said he needed to find out what he believed when no one was watching him. What he wanted when performance was not the organizing principle. He started reading the Gospels, without commentary, without sermon preparation, without asking, what does this mean for Sunday? He said the first time he cried reading scripture in a decade was when he got to the part where Jesus is asleep in the boat during the storm. He said, I had never noticed that he could sleep, that he was tired, that the disciples had to wake him. I had spent 20 years preaching a performing Jesus, and here he was asleep in a storm, and it undid something in me. A Jesus who could be tired, who needed sleep, who trusted the boat to the night, not modeling rest as a lesson, not performing rest for the disciples' benefit, just exhausted and trusting. He said, I had been preaching a yoke that had no sleep in it, and Jesus himself, the one who offered the fitted yoke, was asleep in the storm. The God who sleeps in boats was the image that finally broke something open in Marcus. If you have felt this, and it has been going on for years, hear this directly. You did not fall short of God's yoke. You were handed the wrong one entirely. The exhaustion you feel is not spiritual failure. It is the natural result of a human body and soul trying to carry something that was never designed for your frame. It chafed because it was not fitted, not because you are not strong enough. Jesus said, "My burden is light." The Greek word is elephros, proportionate sized for what you can bear, not weightless. Proportionate sized for a human being without destroying them in the bearing. What you have been carrying is not that. You have not been imagining the weight. He means stop living inside someone else's interpretation of what God requires. Come and find out what was actually asked before it became a system for managing standing before God. The yoke Jesus offers is an invitation into his reading of reality, not a new list of requirements, a different way of seeing what is required at all. That is the shift. And what is required when you trace it all the way back is what the prophets kept saying. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly, not perform, not produce metrics, just walk. Just walk. With someone who walks beside you, not above you. In a yoke that was cut for your specific shoulder in your specific season, carrying what you are already carrying. Marcus, near the end of those 2 years, started going to a small church where no one knew he had ever been in ministry. He sat in the back, quietly. He sang badly and did not care. He cried during communion, and a woman he had never met handed him a tissue without saying a single word to him. He said, "For the first time in 20 years, I went home from church lighter than when I arrived." That is what the right yoke feels like. Not absence of weight, the presence of fit. You were made for a particular kind of following, and the one who made you knows your exact dimensions. You can stop performing now. You can stop. Not because God does not care how you live, because he sees how you live. All of it, including the exhaustion and its first response, is not evaluation. It is come. The rest he offers is not an absence of movement. It is the specific sensation of finally putting down what was never yours to carry and picking up what was always cut for you.